I didn't plan to meet the devil on a Tuesday afternoon in a boutique on Via Monte Carlo, between a rack of silk blouses I couldn't afford and a saleswoman whose smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I didn't plan anything that happened that week. I didn't plan to fall apart in a dressing room, or to walk out of that store with a man the whole city feared, or to watch the woman who'd spent 20 minutes making me feel like an uninvited guest in my own skin swallow every single word she'd ever said. But here's what I've learned about plans. They have a way of dissolving the moment the universe decides you've been small for long enough. And I had been small for a very long time. Not because I was, but because I had been told to be quietly, consistently, by enough people in enough rooms that somewhere along the way I had started believing it was just the shape of my life. My name is Valentina Cruz, and for 31 years I had been the woman people looked through. Not looked past, looked through, like I was a smudged window between them and something more interesting. I was the accountant at Marchetti Holdings who corrected everyone's spreadsheets and received zero credit for it. I was the one who found the error in the Delacroix estate audit that saved the firm $400,000 and got a gift card to a restaurant I couldn't afford in return. I was the daughter my mother introduced as my practical one, which is what people say when they don't want to say plain. I was the woman who bought clothes 2 sizes up to hide myself inside them, who ate salads at work lunches so no one could make a comment, who had trained herself so thoroughly in the art of disappearing that sometimes I scared myself by how good I'd gotten at it. I could walk into a room of 15 people and leave without a single one of them being able to describe me afterward. I had made an entire skill out of my own erasure. And I was, until 11 days before that Tuesday, the girlfriend of Rodrigo Estefan, junior partner at a downtown law firm, well-dressed, charming at parties, and apparently deeply embarrassed by the body he'd been sleeping next to for 2 years. He didn't say it cruelly when he ended it. That was almost the worst part. He said it gently, the way you explain to a child that they can't keep the stray dog. He said that he needed someone who fit the image of where his career was going. He said the partners' wives were a certain type, and the fundraising galas required a certain look, and he hoped I understood. He really did, because he had genuine affection for me, genuine affection. Like I was a comfortable chair he was donating to a thrift store. I said nothing. I nodded. I left his apartment with my overnight bag and a smile so steady it didn't crack until I was 3 blocks away and sitting on a bench in the rain. And then it cracked entirely, and I cried until I had nothing left. I cried for myself, which I rarely did. I cried for the 2 years I had moderated myself around him. The portions I'd kept small, the dresses I'd left on the rack, the opinions I'd softened, the space I'd taken up as little of as possible so he would keep choosing me. He had not kept choosing me. And the worst thing, the thing that sat in my chest like a stone for the full 11 days that followed, was that I wasn't even surprised. That was 11 days before the Tuesday. In those 11 days I went to work. I fixed the Marchetti Holdings third quarter projections that Rodrigo's own firm had botched. Errors so elementary, I'd had to close my office door before I laughed. I ate alone. I slept badly, and I made one decision. I was going to stop hiding. I don't know where it came from. Some quiet, stubborn thing at the bottom of me that had apparently been waiting for exactly this much humiliation before it stood up. It was not a grand resolution. It was small and specific, and it was this. I was going to buy something beautiful. Something fitted, something that didn't apologize for the shape of the body wearing it. I was going to walk into an expensive boutique on Via Monte Carlo, the kind of place I'd always stood outside of and admired through the glass like a child outside a bakery. And I was going to try something on, and I was not going to feel ashamed. The boutique was called Isidora. It had a cream-colored awning and a door that opened to a chime of small brass bells. And the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the temperature of the room change, not literally, but in the way that rooms change when something walks in that doesn't belong, or more accurately, when something walks in that the people inside have decided doesn't belong. The interior was all pale travertine and low ivory lighting, and racks of things that were clearly not meant to hold price tags because the people who bought them didn't need to check. There were two other saleswomen near the back, and a woman shopping in a coral blazer who looked like she'd been born in that kind of light. The saleswoman who came to me was tall, highlighted, wearing a cream silk blouse that probably cost what I made in 3 days, and bearing the particular smile of someone who has already made a judgment and is now managing it politely. Her name tag said Serena. She asked if I needed help. I said I was looking for a dress, something for an evening event. She nodded slowly, with that smile, and suggested I try the back section, where the pieces ran a slightly wider range of sizing. She said it quietly, conspiratorially, as if she were doing me a favor, woman to woman, steering me towards something that would save me from myself. The woman in the coral blazer looked up. She didn't look away. I felt the look land on the side of my face like a hand. Serena walked me to a rack of shapeless dark wraps near a fire exit, and I stood there for a moment. One moment, just one. And then, something in me picked up the knife that had been lying on the floor since Rodrigo's apartment, and I reached past the wraps and pulled out a gown from the main floor. Fitted crimson silk off the shoulder, bias cut, a dress that knew exactly what it was doing and had no interest in being forgiving about it. I asked if I could try it on. Serena's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. She said, quite pleasantly, that she wasn't sure that particular piece would be comfortable for my frame, and that she wouldn't want me to be disappointed. Comfortable. For my frame. I heard both words land with the precision of a woman who has been hearing that language her entire life, in different arrangements, from different mouths. I said I'd like to try it on anyway, and Serena said, with the patience of someone who is very used to being right, that she could put me in something lovely that would be more forgiving. And wasn't that the better option? And the other saleswoman, half hidden behind the register, let out a sound. Not quite a laugh, compressed at the last second, barely a breath. But I heard it. It was a small sound. It did something large. I stood there holding the crimson dress in the middle of Isidora boutique on Via Monte Carlo, and something in my chest that had been bending for 11 days came very close to breaking entirely. The woman in coral had gone back to her browsing. Serena was still smiling. The brass bells over the door had gone quiet. And I was about to do what I had always done, which was to put the dress back and thank Serena for her time, and walk out and go home and tell myself it didn't matter. And then the door opened. Not dramatically. Not with any of the theatrical timing that the moment would later seem to deserve. It simply opened. The brass bells chimed once, and the light from the street shifted the way light shifts when something large and certain steps into a room and changes the pressure of the air. I didn't know who he was. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that moment. I had no idea. I only knew that the room changed again. More dramatically this time, in the way a room changes when something genuinely dangerous walks in. Not something wrong. Something real and rare and operating at a frequency the rest of the room wasn't built for. He was tall in the way that takes up actual space, not just physical height. Dark suit, no tie, a watch on his wrist that probably had its own security detail. The kind of jaw that looks like it was made to make decisions and never revisit them. He moved the way certain men move, not fast, not slow, but with the specific gravity of someone for whom rooms have always rearranged themselves. He was with a man behind him who was even larger, stone-faced, dark-coated, who positioned himself near the door without being asked, because he had clearly done this 10,000 times and had long since stopped needing instruction. The boutique went entirely silent. Even the brass bells seemed to regret their own noise. His eyes moved across the room once, quickly, in the manner of a man who catalogs threats before he catalogs anything else. And then they stopped. On me. On the crimson dress in my hands. On Serena. still standing there with her helpful, patient, managing smile. He walked toward us, not toward the racks, not toward the register, toward us specifically, and I felt every single hair on my arm stand at attention. He stopped at a distance that was technically polite and absolutely did not feel polite. He looked at Serena. He said very quietly, "What did you just say to her?" Serena opened her mouth. He didn't wait for the answer. He looked at me instead, and his eyes were the color of deep water and approximately as warm. And he said, still quietly, the way a man says things when he knows that quiet is the most frightening volume available, "Try it on." And then he looked at Serena again and said, "And you, find her every version of that dress in the store, every color, every piece on this floor she wants, all of it." Serena had gone the color of old paper. She said, "Of course, sir." She did not ask his name. She already knew it. I could tell by the way the question didn't form, by the way she moved immediately and without protest, that she already knew exactly who she had just made the mistake of condescending to in front of. I tried on the crimson dress. I stood in the Isidora fitting room with its ivory walls and soft upward lighting, and I stepped into that silk, and I did the zip, and I turned to the full-length mirror, and I gripped the brass rail bolted to the wall because something cracked open in me that I didn't have a name for yet, but that felt, distantly and powerfully, like the beginning of something true. The dress did not hide me. It celebrated me. Every curve I had spent years engineering clothes to obscure. The dress gathered and held and declared, I had a waist. I had hips. I had a body that had been living apologetically inside oversized linen for so long that seeing it clearly, in silk, in light, felt almost violent. The good kind. The kind that shakes something loose. I stood there for a full minute before I went back out. When I came out, he was sitting in the low velvet chair near the fitting area, alone. His man near the door, the saleswomen evidently occupied elsewhere. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and his expression did not change, which on another man would have read as indifference. On him it read as the opposite. Then he said, "It fits." Like that. 2 words, flat and certain, as if he was closing a question the dress had already answered, and somehow those 2 words dismantled more of the 11 days than anything else had. His name was Emilio Rivaro. I didn't learn it that day. That day I learned only that his voice was low, and that he didn't waste it, and that he had a way of looking at a person that felt like being read in a language you didn't know you were written in. He asked me where I was going, wearing the dress. I told him I didn't have anywhere to go, that I just needed to try it on. He studied me, in that still, unhurried way, not with pity, and not with the performative admiration men sometimes deploy to seem safe. He looked at me like someone identifying a thing of value that has been incorrectly priced. He said, "Then find the occasion." He stood. He buttoned his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who does everything at his own pace, including things that other people would rush. He walked to the register without looking at a single price tag, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind for whom price tags are other people's concern. And he bought the dress. Then he bought the next one Serena had surfaced, and the one after that. Then he looked at Serena and said, "I'll take the rest as well." Serena said very quietly, "Sir, the whole floor." He said, "I'm aware of what I said." He paid. He put every piece in my name. Then he turned back to me and extended a card. Cream-colored, heavy stock, just a phone number pressed into it. No name, no title, because men like him don't require titles. And he said, "When you find the occasion, call." And he left. I stood in Isidora boutique on Via Monte Carlo for approximately 45 seconds after the door closed before I realized I was shaking. Not with fear. With something I didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Serena stood at the register with a receipt in her hand for a sum that I later calculated, when I stopped feeling dizzy, was somewhere just north of $42,000. She was looking at the door. She looked at me. I looked back at her, and I let the silence sit between us like a verdict. Then I picked up the crimson dress in its garment bag, and I walked out, and I kept my spine straight all the way down via Monte Carlo until I turned the corner onto a side street. And then I sat on a step and pressed my hands flat against my thighs, and I thought, what just happened? I called the number on the card 3 days later. I'm not going to pretend I waited because I was playing a game. I waited because I needed 3 days to believe it had been real. He answered on the second ring and said nothing, just waited, and I said, I think I've found the occasion. He said, tell me. And I did. I told him about the Estefan and Partners annual charity gala, the one Rodrigo had brought me to for 2 years running, the one I had apparently been removed from the guest list of this year, replaced by a woman named Claudette, who I had seen in Rodrigo's firm's social posts, long-legged and composed, and exactly the image of where his career was going. I told Emilio all of it, more than I intended to, because he had a quality of listening that made you feel that the truth was safe in his hands. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer reassurances or perform sympathy. He simply listened until I was finished. Then he was quiet for one beat. Then he said, I'll pick you up at 8. What happened in the weeks between that call and the night of the gala, and there were nearly 3 weeks because Emilio Rivaro did absolutely nothing carelessly, is its own story and worth telling in full. He sent a woman named Dorota to my apartment at 9 in the morning the day after our call. Dorota was 70 years old, Polish, silver-haired, with a measuring tape around her neck and the energy of someone who had been doing this since before I was born and had run out of patience for ceremony sometime around 1987. She spent 4 hours taking measurements with the precision of a surgeon and the personality of someone who considered small talk to be a form of theft. She wrote everything in a small green notebook. She took photographs, clinical, unsentimental, documentary. She left without telling me what she was making. Emilio called that evening and said only, trust her. I said I didn't know what I was trusting her with. He said, your armor. I thought about that word for a long time after we hung up. Over the following days, there were fittings, 3 of them, each at my apartment, Dorota arriving exactly on time with a garment bag and leaving no room for discussion. The gown emerged slowly, navy silk, draped, structured through the bodice in a way that Dorota engineered with the quiet mastery of a woman who understood that the right boning in the right place is not about restriction, but about architecture. It made my waist feel like something to be reckoned with. The silk moved when I moved, heavy and deliberate, and every time I stood in front of my bathroom mirror in it, I had to remind myself to breathe. There was jewelry. Borrowed. Emilio was careful to specify, not gifted, though the borrowed pieces arrived in a velvet case delivered by a man in a dark car who did not give his name and did not wait for thanks. 3 strands of Kashmiri sapphires at the throat, deep blue-black stones in a gold setting that was probably older than the boutique they'd been bought from. Earrings that caught light and released it slowly, like something making a decision. There was a glam team on the evening of the gala. 2 women, precise and efficient, who worked in focused silence and left me standing in my bathroom 90 minutes later, looking at someone I recognized but had not seen clearly in a very long time. He was at the curb at 8 exactly. Black car, long, Fabrice at the wheel. Emilio stepped out and his eyes went to me and stayed, and he said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough for me to understand it. Then he offered his arm. I took it. His hand closed over mine on his forearm, warm, steady, absolutely certain. And he said quietly, close to my temple, "You are extraordinary, Valentina. Remember that when we walk in." He did not say it like a man working to convince a nervous woman. He said it like a man reading coordinates off a map he trusted completely. The Estefan and Partners Gala was held at the Palazzo Luce, a venue with marble floors and 40-foot ceilings, and the specific architectural intention of making everyone inside feel simultaneously important and small. The kind of place built to remind you that someone, somewhere, has more. The doors were open. Candlelight threw amber across the marble. Conversation was at its usual bright mid-evening pitch, the sound of people performing ease at volume. I've walked into rooms before and felt invisible. I have also, a handful of times in my life, walked into rooms and felt something tilt, the attention of a space shift, the way a compass needle moves when something magnetic enters the room. When Emilio Ravaro and I walked through the doors of the Palazzo Luce, the room did not tilt. It stopped. Not dramatically, not all at once. It ran out of breath in ripples, like a stone dropped in still water, conversations trailing to silence outward from the door. Heads turned. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else stopped mid-sentence and did not finish it. Emilio moved through the stillness like a man who had been waited for, which is perhaps because, in most rooms in this city, he had been. I moved with him, spine straight, sapphires catching candlelight, the navy silk moving the way Dorota had promised it would, and I did not look for Rodrigo. I let Rodrigo find me. He found me at the champagne table 8 minutes after we arrived. I had felt his stare from across the room almost immediately. That particular quality of attention that belongs to a man watching a mistake he cannot take back. He appeared at my elbow with the studied casualness of someone who has rehearsed an approach and is now discovering it doesn't fit the situation. He said, "Valentina, you look," and stopped, because he had turned to look at whoever I was with, and whoever I was with had turned to look at him. And something drained from Rodrigo Estefan's face in that moment that I do not believe ever fully returned. He went the color of chalk. He said, with great care, "Mr. Ravaro." Emilio said nothing. He looked at Rodrigo with the patient, total attention of a man who does not need to speak to make a point. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was the best 4 seconds of my year. Claudette materialized at Rodrigo's side, tall, angular, put together with the precision of a woman who had understood the assignment. And she looked at me with the rapid assessment women sometimes perform on one another in social situations, the kind that takes in clothes and jewelry and posture in under 3 seconds and draws conclusions. Then she looked at Emilio, and the assessment changed quality entirely. I watched the recognition move through her the same way I'd watched it move through Serena in the boutique. That particular recalibration, that realization that the landscape had been different all along from what she'd assumed. Rodrigo touched her elbow and guided her away, and she went, though she looked back once, and I did not return the look. I turned to Emilio and sipped my champagne. He said under his breath, "Just for me. He knows what he gave up." I said, "He does now." Emilio almost smiled. I had learned by then that with him, almost was its own complete sentence. The corridor confrontation happened at 9:30, when I slipped away from the main hall to find a breath of cooler air. The Palazzo Luce had a long corridor of pale stone running alongside the garden, with tall arched windows that let in the night and the smell of the jasmine outside, and I stood at one of them with my champagne and gave myself a moment of quiet, the first in hours. I was thinking, if I'm honest, about nothing in particular. I was just breathing. I heard him before I saw him, the sound of leather soles on marble at a pace that was faster than the gala's usual drift, deliberate and tracking. Rodrigo appeared at the corridor's far end and stopped when he saw me. He looked, for perhaps the first time in our entire acquaintance, genuinely unmoored. The composure he wore at every event, the easy confidence of a man who knows which fork to use and whose name to drop. It had slipped, and underneath it, he looked like someone who had walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged. He said my name. I said nothing. He walked toward me, and I did not move. Not toward him, not away. Just stayed at the window with my champagne and my spine straight, because I had earned the right to occupy that particular piece of pale stone corridor, and I was going to use every inch of it. He said, "I didn't know you and Rivaro were—" He stopped, recalibrated. "How long has that been?" I said. "Long enough." He said, "Valentina," and his voice had gone to that softer register it used to have in the first months, before I became a liability. He said, "I made a mistake." I waited. He said, "I handled things badly. I was thinking about all the wrong things. I can see that now." I looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. I thought about the bench in the rain 3 blocks from his apartment, the overnight bag, genuine affection. I said, "Rodrigo, you didn't lose a girlfriend. You lost a woman who was correcting your client's accounting mistakes for free and didn't yet know what she was worth." I let that settle in the air between us, where it belonged. Then I said, "I know now." I walked back toward the light and the noise of the main hall, and I felt nothing behind me as I went. Not grief, not anger, not even the mild aftertaste of satisfaction. Just air, clean, cool, and entirely mine. The evening cracked open at 10:47. I know the time because I had checked my watch when the Marchetti Holdings segment of the program began. A charity auction presentation, the firm's annual donation to a children's literacy foundation, the theatrical generosity of people who can afford to be generous in public. Rodrigo was at the podium, smooth and practiced, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who does not yet know the floor is gone. Fabrice moved quietly to the AV coordinator at the side of the room. I noticed because I was watching for it. Emilio had placed his hand lightly at the small of my back perhaps 30 seconds earlier, which I had come to understand was his way of saying, "Pay attention, something is about to happen." The Marchetti Holdings logo on the main screen flickered, went dark, was replaced without drama, without announcement, by a document, a financial document. 14 pages of systematic embezzlement against the Marchetti Estate Trust, conducted over the better part of 3 years, documented with the specificity of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at, which I did, because I was the one who had found it. 6 weeks ago, in the ordinary course of a quarterly reconciliation, I had pulled a thread that should not have been there, and pulled it, and kept pulling, until the whole architecture of it was visible. I had not known what to do with what I found. It turned out Emilio knew precisely what to do with it, and had known since the evening I'd told him everything on the phone, and had spent 3 weeks making sure that when it came to light in exactly this room, in front of exactly these people, with exactly this timing. The room took roughly 20 seconds to understand what it was reading. Then it erupted in the specific way that rooms full of lawyers and financiers erupt, not loudly, but thoroughly. A wave of urgent murmured conversation, phones materializing, faces turning toward the podium, where Rodrigo Estefan had gone entirely, perfectly still. The way something goes still when it understands that movement is no longer an option. A man in a dark suit near the east exit moved toward him. Not Fabrice, a different man, with the quiet purposefulness of someone carrying documentation and a legal mandate and zero interest in the theatrical elements of the moment. Rodrigo looked across the crowded room. He found my face. I looked back at him. I did not smile. I raised my champagne glass very slightly, not a toast, just an acknowledgement, the gesture of a woman who is done. And then I turned away, because I was finished looking at him, and there was nothing left in that direction worth seeing. Emilio walked me out at 11. The night air on the Palazzo Lutz steps was cool and smelled of jasmine from the garden and the distant river and something mineral from the old stone of the building, and I stopped on the 3rd step down and breathed it in until my lungs felt clean. I felt, standing on those steps, the strange and specific sensation of putting down something you have carried so long you had forgotten it had weight. The version of me that shrank, The version that ate carefully and dressed apologetically and nodded and packed her overnight bag. I put her down on the steps of the Palazzo Luce and I left her there. Emilio stopped one step below me and turned to look up at me, which meant for once we were at eye level. He looked at me for a long moment, and his expression had in it something I had not seen there before. Not the cold assessment of a man cataloging a room, but something quieter and more deliberate. Then he reached up and touched my jaw with his fingertips, very lightly, and said, "There she is." I said, "There she is." And he kissed me on the steps of the Palazzo Luce while the city made its noise below us and the Kashmiri sapphires caught the last of the light, and I thought, this is what it feels like when you finally stop making yourself smaller than your own life. There is a postscript to the Isidora boutique story, and it is the part I think about most. 3 days after the gala, I learned that Emilio had not stopped at $42,000 worth of silk and sapphire loans. He had returned to Isidora the morning after the boutique encounter and made a different kind of purchase. He bought the boutique, the entire thing, the lease, the inventory, the brand license, the cream-colored awning, and the brass bells over the door. He transferred the deed into my name with a note, handwritten on that same heavy cream stock, that said only, "So no one tells you what fits again." I stood in my kitchen in my bathrobe, holding that piece of paper for a long time. Then I called Dorota. I asked her if she wanted to run the alterations department. She said yes, and hung up before I could finish the sentence, which is the only possible Dorota response. I called a property lawyer. I called a boutique manager I knew from a networking event 3 years ago who had always been looking for the right space. I began to build something. Serena, as of the new ownership's first working week, was no longer on staff. I did not orchestrate that specifically. It was simply one of those things that happens naturally when a room finally understands who it belongs to. I still have the crimson dress. I have worn it exactly twice. Once on the evening Emilio took me to dinner at a place with no sign on the door and wine that cost more than my rent, and once on a quiet Tuesday in his private dining room, just the two of us, because he asked me to, and because there is something right and full circle about wearing the dress that started everything on an ordinary Tuesday in the life it helped begin. That second evening, over wine, he told me why he had walked into Isidora. He said Fabrice had a standing instruction. Every man in Emilio's employ had the same instruction, to flag when someone was being made to feel small in a public place. He had instituted that instruction years ago, he said, because he had once watched someone he loved be treated the way Serena had treated me, in a shop not unlike Isidora, and he had not been there. He had been 2 blocks away on a different errand, and by the time he knew it was happening, it was already over, and he had carried the weight of that for longer than was reasonable. He said this quietly, like a man releasing something long held, and I listened without filling the silence, because some things need to be put down without interruption. Afterward, I took his hand across the table and held it, and we didn't say anything else about it, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Some losses become instructions. Some instructions become the exact moment that changes everything for someone who needed it. You are still here, and I am so glad, because that last piece, the standing instruction, the thing he has been carrying for years, Fabrice watching the door, I could not stop thinking about it when I first understood it, and I don't think you will be able to either. If this story moved you the way it moved me, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that the woman standing in the boutique holding the dress she's afraid to try on is always the one who deserves it most. Subscribe if you're new here and ring that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming, because the next story is already keeping me awake. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment that got you? Because I need to know I'm not the only one still thinking about that champagne glass.